Very good morning and a warm welcome to everybody that's joined us today. My name is Nikita and I'll be hosting the session today. And before we start, I'd just like to take a quick minute to introduce India Leaders for Social Sector to those of you who are joining us for the first time. ILSS is a learning and leadership development organization for the social sector. And when we started 2 years ago, it was with our flagship leadership program that intended to help executives, senior executives from other sectors such as corporates, armed forces, government services, and so on, who wanted to move into the development sector and make an informed and meaningful transition. So we run this as a very comprehensive 9-day residential program, the next edition of which is coming soon, and I'll share more about that. But in the meantime, ILSS Online is our attempt to bring to you curated conversations from industry leaders, experts in a host of social development issues, academics, policymakers, and so on, to share their thoughts around the current situation around COVID and beyond, what's in store for us in the development sector. And we'll soon also be launching our capacity building programs for social sector professionals, which we hope to kickstart with a course for fundraising professionals. So if you enjoyed today's session, please do look up our website. Our next 9-day leadership program is scheduled for August this year, and applications are already open. They will be reviewed on a rolling basis. So look us up, reach out if you'd like more details about that. We'll be happy to walk you through it. And coming back to today's session, we have with us, we're very, very thrilled to have with us Pavan, who's the director at the Center of Social and Behaviour Change, which was set up by Ashoka University and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He has previously also held the portfolio of director for Center for Experimental Social Sciences at Flame University and has served as a faculty member at IIM Ahmedabad, where he taught legal aspects of policies and business, contracts, negotiations, conflict resolution, and so on. He's also taught research methodologies for doctoral programs and mentored senior government officials, including IPS, National Police Academy, IS, and so on. And he's also held positions at other institutions such as IIM Bangalore, MIT Sloan, University of Michigan Law School, and the Harvard Law School. So today, Pavan will be speaking with us from his experience in behavioral sciences, especially some of the big ideas in behavioral sciences to do with policy and how it can be, using examples, how it can be applied in the Indian context. So welcome again, Pavan. Thank you so much. Thrilled to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Nikita. It's such a pleasure to be here with you to speak about some of the stuff that we do and the stuff that I really find deeply interesting and highly pertinent to the times. Thanks to Anu and thanks to ILSS for having me. At the very outset, I thought I would start off by structuring my interaction with you by throwing some big ideas in sequence, and then we can, and hopefully that will generate some discussion as we go forward. Let us start with just a sort of at least a rudimentary understanding of what we mean by rationality and how it sometimes tends to get misused, and from there we can sort of try and proceed in the direction of trying to understand what we mean by irrationality and how behavioral economists and behavioral scientists very normally engage with human irrationality and systematize our understanding of human irrationality and even leverage it in a way that it can be useful to accomplishing ends that are privately useful as well as socially useful. Rationality has been a topic of immense philosophical discussion. I mean, ranging from your sort of Kantian interpretations of rationality to much more sort of operational kinds of interpretations of rationality by neoclassical economists. Some of the sort of the big interpretations have been that the first one would be an obedience to a principle of non-contradiction. If you say something and to contradict that simultaneously or a little later would be considered irrational. So adherence to non-contradiction would be a form of rationality. And, this is ensconced in a principle called an a priori truth. I mean, if I were to, for instance, say John is the uncle of Paul, and if I were to later on say that Paul is the nephew of John, they're almost tautological, and therefore one is a rational inference from another. Then you also have another kind of pernicious definition of rationality, or rather it has been made pernicious in the history of ideas, and that is the interpretation that rationality is the maximization of utility, maximization of happiness. It's a sort of a utilitarian understanding of rationality. And somehow, somewhere along the lines, somewhere in history of ideas, this form of rationality has been misconstrued as the mere pursuit of the maximization of one's alone happiness, or rather selfishness. So it's a maximization of wealth, it's a maximization of private utility, and so on. So rationality became, if you're rational, then you should be selfish. They became interchangeably used. And then there are a couple of other principles of rationality. I mean, there's the principle of, for instance, transitivity. It's a mathematical principle that if you say that A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then it's the principle of mathematical transitivity would have you believe that A is greater than C. But if you were to apply this in the context of everyday choices that we make, I might like mangoes more than bananas and bananas more than oranges, but I could actually like oranges more than mangoes. And that would immediately be a violation of the principle of rationality. But economists would expect people to hold to this principle of transitivity in the way that they make choices. And that is deeply problematic. And there's another principle of rationality, and that is that there is a stability of differences. If I like A more than B today, if I like bananas more than mangoes today, I should continue liking bananas more than mangoes down the road. We'll come back to a few examples of how this is systematically violated in human decision making. So the first sort of historical note to throw out there for your consideration and for your thinking is this thing that happened in the history of the development of economics. That neoclassical economists, it's not as if they were not aware of the fact that human beings were incapable of, or rather were not capable of being irrational. But they assume that since humans are capable of rationality, that they will continue to be rational in all decision making. The mere capacity to be rational was, went down the slippery slope into an assumption that individuals are rational all the time. And that's where they opened up a window into a wide variety of economic models, which became bad predictors of human behavior, and that led to also bad policies. And so that's one big idea from the history of science, of the history of economics, that one needs to think about. The moment we come into construing human behavior as being capable of the rational side, as well as the irrational side, we are led to this fundamental dualism that we encounter in the way humans think and humans make decisions. And this is called, and there's an expression, there's a term to describe this, and this is called a form of cognitive bilateralism. And cognitive bilateralism identifies two types of systems. This is sort of the nomenclature of Daniel Kahneman. He says there's systems one, and then there's systems two, way of thinking. Systems one is construed to be, is considered to be this very quick, very intuitive way of arriving at decisions. Whereas systems two is considered to be a very slow and a methodical way of arriving at decisions through thinking. So rationality, hyper-rationality, or rather neoclassical rationality would ordinarily gets assumed by systems 2. Systems 1 is a much quicker way of making decisions. Let me give you a quick example to illustrate this. If I were to, for instance, throw an object at you, your immediate reaction, almost in an unthinking manner, would be to duck, to avoid being hit by that object, without even having the luxury of the time necessary to evaluate whether that object could actually really harm, and whether that harm is greater than the cost of ducking, right? You don't have that time. You instinctively almost react to it using your systems 1. If you were to, for instance, use your systems 2 and then later discover that it's actually a steel object and that it could have hurt you, then clearly, ducking was a good thing, and your systems 1 then happily coincided with your systems 2. Similarly, if you're walking down your lawn and you were to observe a sinusoidal object, your systems 1 would make you jump away from it because you would probably think that it's a snake and that it's poisonous and that it could bite you. The likelihood of every sinusoidal object in this world being a snake is really very low. And even lesser is the probability that the snake is poisonous. But systems 1 has its own evolutionary purposes, and we can talk a little about that. But systems 1 tends to be a sort of a very quick process, whereas systems 2 tends to be a slower process, which leads us to better decisions, or rather rational decisions. Not necessarily better decisions, but rational decisions. Because systems 1 can also can lead you into a form of decision making which can be useful for your survival from an evolutionary point of view. So this is the sort of another big idea that I wanted to bring for your consideration, and that is the classification of our cognitive activities into systems 1 and systems 2. If I can show my slides, Nikita, may I? Am I already
Pavan,
sharing it?
No. So if you could just share your screen again, they'll be visible. Also, Pavan, since you paused, if it's possible to turn off the light behind you, I think it will work better.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a window open. Is that better?
It looks better.
I don't think I can do any better. Yeah.
No worries.
You must forgive me. Next time I will be better prepared. Okay. Let me give you a couple of examples. Now that I've already primed you about this distinction between systems 1 and systems 2, here is a sort of a visual sort of a question. And these are borrowed from, I think this image is borrowed from Max Beserman's book. It shows two tables, which are, and the question is, which table is bigger? And if you were to use your systems 1, you would kind of be inclined into believing that the first table is longer than the second table and the second table is wider than the first table. This is your systems 1 giving you that response, right? This is one example. We'll get to the answer. We'll get to how we can use systems 2 to try and decide which table is bigger or smaller as we move forward. Let me throw another problem at you. Consider, this is Richard Taylor's example. And this dramatically illustrates the gap between the kind of conclusions that we arrive from systems 1 and systems 2. Imagine that there are two metal rails. Each one is 1 kilometer long, and they're lying adjacent to each other in this following manner. And this is represented by the two halves at the bottom of the triangle. It is summer, and these two rails now expand by 1 centimeter each. So in other words, they bump up a little, the two rails. And they bump up and they're raised by a small amount, let's call it x. Now, if I were to ask you to use, and Nikita, and I'm going to ask you this question, if I were to ask you to use your intuition in determining what X could be, what might be your answer?
I'd basically use the Pythagoras theorem to.
Approximately 10 centimeters. Is it below 10 centimeters? Give me a range. Below 10 centimeters, below 20 centimeters, or around 3 centimeters. What would be your guess? Use your systems one. Don't calculate.
Less than 10.
Less
the
than
height
10.
of X would be 1 centimeter.
The height of, okay, that's your intuition telling you, and I'll probably make a similar guess, right? I mean, something very small, equivalent to the increase in the length of these two rays. Now, if I were to use systems 2, which is the simple application of the Pythagoras theorem, at X being equal to 450 centimeters, that is 4.5 meters high. And that's dramatically higher than what we arrive at by using our systems one. And this is a great illustration of how we can systematically go wrong when we depend on systems one. And systems one is a natural way in which the human mind thinks, right? And that's something that you need to bear in mind. So when economists think that people are always going to very quickly act like Sheldon Cooper of Big Bang Theory and arrive at calculations very quickly, they're actually making a mistake. People don't in the real world are not Sheldon Coopers or Spocks out of Star Trek, right? So there is a dramatic gap when we depend between systems 2 and systems 1 conclusion. This is a good example. Now, returning to our previous visual question, a systems 2 person would try and juxtapose the two tables and empirically verify and see whether the two tables are of the same size or not, and not so much depend on systems 1, right? So this is the first sort of big idea that I wanted to throw out there. But this has tremendous implications in the way we construct policy. Because when we assume that people are going to be only systems 2, when they actually are not, they're going to create terrible policies, right? I mean, there's this wonderful example given by Sendil Mullainathan, who's a brilliant economist at the University of Chicago. He talks about a child suffering from diarrhea, right? Now, what is the mental model of diarrhea? A mental model of diarrhea is an object which has a heat which leaks liquid. That's your heuristic. That's your systems 1 way of thinking about it. And the systems 1 way of thinking about it leads you into believing that the way to solve the problem is actually to stop pouring any liquid into the object, right? So in other words, you stop giving any liquids to the child and thereby inflict upon the child dehydration, which is one of the biggest reasons why kids with diarrhea die, right? So a dependence on systems 1 can lead to these kinds of consequences which are not necessarily desirable. So that's another sort of example that I wanted to give you, to bear on this discussion. Let me give you another big concept from the world of behavioral economics for your consideration. I'm sure most of you who have done basic economics are familiar with this graph. I'm sorry it's a little warped because I have a picture from a book. This is again Richard Taylor's book. This principle is called the Law of Diminishing Marginal. The x-axis measures an increase in the amount that you consume, maybe biscuits or food or whatever, right? The y-axis measures the amount of happiness that you receive, or the amount of utility that you receive. And you notice that this curve is is not a linear curve, right? In other words, the rate at which you stand to derive utility from every increase in the good that you consume tends to get lesser and lesser. So it's sort of a curve. And this is a sort of and this is a thing, this is a behavioral thing that was discovered by Bernoulli, the great scientist, right? The great thinker. Bernoulli is the same guy after whom the Bernoulli's principle in hydrodynamics is named after. He's the guy who discovered that when the velocity of a fluid is high, the pressure decreases, and that causes the differential between the vectors on top of an airplane wing and below an airplane wing, which actually explains why airplanes and birds fly. I mean, it's made this fundamental contribution to our understanding of hydrodynamics, who came up with this relationship between what we consume and the rate at which we gain utility. So this is a wonderful understanding of human behavior, and this was used as the standard way of interpreting human behavior in economics. And then we went forward, and then came to these amazing, incredible psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who said, okay, as regards increases in consumption and increases in benefits, Bernoulli is right. So the upper right quadrant very nicely explains that. But the moment you start thinking about losses, the rate at which you stand to lose utility or happiness tends to be much higher than the rate at which you stand to gain utility or pleasure for gains. So in other words, there's a fundamental asymmetry, and that's the thing that you notice here. You notice that the upper right quadrant has a curve which is more gentle, whereas the left lower quadrant has a curve which has a far steeper curve, indicating that the rate at which you stand to lose happiness when you lose a little bit is much higher than if you were to gain something. And this fundamental discovery about human behavior became the basis of what is called as prospect theory. This is the most profound contribution made by Kahneman and Tversky, his friend Tversky. Now, this has a huge response. First question is, why is it that there is this asymmetry?
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I think there's some bandwidth issue. It might be helpful if you try turning off your video, and if you could put your slides on the presentation mode, then they'll be a little bit bigger for the audience.
I don't know how to do that.
The slideshow mode, maybe the play button on the top right that you see. A little bit.
I'm done with showing images. Okay. I'm done with showing images. I could move forward. I mean, sorry about this. You can't hear me too clearly. Let's see this. Does this work better?
You're sounding fine right now. I thought if we could try turning off your video briefly, maybe it'll save you some time.
Okay. Do you know how to turn it off for me if you don't mind?
I'll do that, yes.
Stop video. I got it. Sorry, guys. Okay. All right. So this is prospect theory, right? And it talks about this fundamental in how we weigh benefits as against how we weigh losses. And this has several consequences, right? So let's go through a couple of policy examples. Let's get into some examples of how we can potentially apply behavioral science to the end of public policy. One of my favorite examples is this full field study done by SWs in behavior. I use behavioral science in a slightly loose manner. It's not behavioral economics per se, but it's a fun application of our understanding of human behavior, empirical understanding of. So, what is the problem she tried to address here? She tried to address the problem that a lot of parents don't go out and immunize kids, right? Which is a form of, which from a purely neoclassical economics point of view should be irrational. Why? Because kids are most precious things. And, sorry I said things, but kids are very precious to us. And yet, we are not willing to go out and immunize, right? Even though immunization potentially saves their lives. So it's not such a rational thing to do. And the cultural solution of public policy has been use mobile immunization camps, increased frequency of such camps, also. And these interventions produced very marginal effects. They did not produce great effects. And so Esther Duflo said, okay, let's do something very simple. So simple that it can have dramatic outcomes. She said, let's offer parents 1 kg of lentils, dal, per shot of vaccine received by the child, and a set of 3 thalis if the child completes a full course of shopping. A small little incentive. And guess what? The impact is a 519% increase in immunization. So this is a very powerful example to illustrate how we actually start thinking, actually use empathy in thinking about the constraints of parents, especially poor people, and see how we can make it easy, how we can incentivize them to do things which are potentially useful. And this was done as a field experiment. And this is one of my favorite examples of a more empirically nuanced way of human understanding can potentially lead to better outcomes, policy applications. That's the first example. Let me give you another wonderful example. This is one of my favorite examples of how to solve a problem that I had earlier alluded to when I talked about stability references. Let me give you a scenario. If there are several of you who are parents of teenage kids in ordinary times, pre-COVID times, I can imagine that these kids had exams the next day, but on that particular evening before the examinations, they wanted to go out and party. Now they party late into the night and come back and say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set an alarm to wake up in the morning and study for my exam. I'll wake up at 5 in the morning and study for my exam. At that particular time, setting the alarm, my preference is that studying for the exam is better than sleeping a little extra. Right? So A is greater than B. So I go to sleep, set the alarm, I wake up in the morning, and then in the morning, I'm a different person because my choices change. I value my sleep a little more than preparing for the exam, and I turn my alarm. So this problem is called time inconsistency. It's time inconsistency because my preferences have changed. The value of my preferences has changed for me. So what do? So I switch my alarm off in the morning. So here is a brilliant design intervention idea. And what it tells us, and the way it works is, it's supposed to work is, that it's a Wi-Fi enabled alarm, which is connected to your bank account. And when in the morning you turn it off, what it does is, it transfers a bit of your money to a political party that you dislike. Right? In other words, making it costly for you to turn that alarm on. In other words, trying to preserve the stability of the choice that you had at the time that you went to sleep. And this mechanism of tying your own hands is called a commitment device by economists. It's also called bridge burning by some sociologists. Why is it bridge burning? Bridge burning is a technique used by armies to advance and burn the bridges behind them so that they're left optionless down the road so that they can never run back if they want to run back. In other words, you're pre-committing to a particular course of action so as to avoid an instability in your choices as you move forward. And this is a wonderful example of how you can do design, come up with an intervention that can potentially do behavioral problems that you have, namely stability in choices. Other simple examples that come to my mind, take for instance a differential in the sizes of these bins. This is a sort of a visual way to allow you to separate wet waste from dry waste, right? And this is environmentally useful. And if you'll notice, the impact, which is talked about in the slide, piloting with 140,000 households showed an 85% increase in recycling rates. So this is a great example of how you can leverage the visual part of systems one to get people to, in an unthinking manner, separate their waste. So this is another example that I wanted to sort of bring to their attention. I'll talk about this last slide and then I will pause. I don't know how I'm doing for time, and then perhaps I can start. I can leave it open for a discussion. So here is an example from Chicago. There's this one particular turn on the highway where cars tend to continue speeding, and there's a high rate of accidents. Unsafe way of driving and cause accidents. So one conventional solution, which is to use formal institutions, is to impose fines on speeding and increase monitoring by traffic officers. That's the formal institutional mechanism of changing behavior. I mean, you can change behavior in either you have three levels. One is formal institutions, second is informal institutions, and the third one is nudges. Right? Now, they found that increasing monitoring and so on and so forth, increasing fines, did not really result in agent behavior. So now, here comes the where I lost? Was I lost?
Yes, we lost you for a moment.
Okay, my apologies, guys. Is the sound quality bad?
The sound, yes, there is a little bit of breaking, but we lost about like 15 seconds of what you were saying last.
Yeah, okay. So I was telling you about this Chicago road,
yes,
where people were speeding, and imposing fines was not found to be a very effective way of slowing them down, right? So what did they do? They decided to paint these horizontal lines where the spacing of these lines became smaller and smaller. So that when a person driving on these lines, were to drive on these lines, would experience a sense that he or she is driving faster than what they really were, right? So you artificially created a sense of speed in the mind of the driver without going through sort of a systems 2 conduit to get the person to slow down because the person felt that the person was driving fast. This is another great example of how you can use nudging through a redesign of the infrastructure or of the spaces that we occupy. So why don't I pause here and then perhaps throw open the platform for any thoughts, any discussions, any questions that participants might have.
Yeah. Pavan, would you like to try turning on your video now? We'll see if
sure.
it works fine.
Let me see. Yeah, there I am. Yeah, got it.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think I'll start with something that's top of everybody's mind, which is we have multiple people asking this question about how do we use what we know from behavioral sciences in the current COVID context. Are there opportunities to use what we understand about human irrationality currently, especially because so much about like containing the spread of the disease is hinged upon people's behaviors?
I think there are tremendous opportunities to use behavioral science. one of the first idea that comes to my mind is reducing the clutter of messaging that we're doing. I mean, we are inundated with hundreds of messages, literally. And one thing that the government can do is stick to maybe 1, 2, or 3 sharply defined messages and focus on them. The reason being, all these hundreds of messages create a form of cognitive load on my mind. A cognitive load is much like, so the human brain has finite processing capacity. And let's say your computer has finite processing capacity and you open 200 tabs on your web browser. That's going to slow down the tab that you actually want to use to make important decisions, right? So you need to close down those other tabs to basically free up your processing capacity to make decisions in a smarter manner. So messaging tends to clutter up people. So I think it's important to focus on those 2 or 3 important messages. The second, it's also very important to recognize that our policymakers, because they're drawn from the population, are also subject to the same behavioral biases that the population is subject to. So the first challenge is, how do we protect our policymakers from these behavioral biases, right? So are there mechanisms by which you can have a second line of people who are or statisticians working with them, who can give them advice and ask and get them not to rely on their knee-jerk estimates of what's happening in the country, and get them to take more sort of systems 2 kind of decisions, right? My internet connection is unstable. Yes. It says. Are you still able to hear me, Nikita? Yeah.
That last bit, if you could just repeat.
Yeah. So one mechanism would be to try and get somebody else or support the government with a layer of advisory services, by people who are perhaps less or rather more immune to these behavioral biases, like such as statisticians, such as people who work with data, right? And that would be a very useful way of doing it, right? So I think getting behavioral scientists to help the government is a very important way to support the government and get the government not to become susceptible to the very same problems that the public is susceptible to.
Sure.
That's one answer. The third answer that I have is the following, and that is, recognize that our country is dramatically different from wealthy countries. Social proximity is inevitable. It is important for my survival. I mean, if I'm living in Dharavi, Mumbai, I don't have the luxury of a 3-bedroom house where I can, isolate somebody who's sick, right? So if that is indeed a constraint, then messaging people about social distancing, which is targeted at these people who don't have the luxury of social distancing, is suboptimal. Maybe what you need to then signal to them is that they use masks or rather wash hands. But even washing hands, as we are discovering, is a luxury for some people. They don't have running water. So you need to be able to segregate people into different types of risks, and then maybe targeting appropriate messages. And that's I think something that needs to be done. So one way to break down the problem is to look at people from the point of view of, you ask the question, is this activity essential or inessential? If it is essential, then the second line of questioning that you ask is this proximity essential or inessential, right? Or is this proximity inevitable or is it not inevitable? I mean, there could be machine processes where 5 people necessarily have to come together to do it. You can't practice social distancing. So maybe in such situations, when you map that area out on a factory floor, perhaps what you then need to do is look at the composition of those 5 people and then say, maybe 3 of these people are more vulnerable than the others. Can we do some kind of a substitution to replace them with less vulnerability, right? So you need to think through our spaces, you need to think through our activities in a very analytical manner with a view to minimizing the risk that people are subject to.
Right.
No, it's a sort of a broad answer, but sorry.
No, that's useful, Pavan. In fact, just to, while I know that every country has a different context and you already said that we're different from the wealthy nations, but have you come across any interesting examples of maybe nudges devised by, any of the countries or even within India? Have you seen anything interesting happening that leverages our understanding of behavior science?
There are some fabulous nudges. I love this nudge from India. Outside shops, outside liquor shops, you see these circles drawn on the ground. That's absolutely brilliant. Why? Because when you lay the floor with a grid or with signs which indicate that you have to stand this far apart from each other, the norm gets embedded in the infrastructure. Right? Norms need not be textual, norms need not be psychological, norms can be infrastructural as well. A social norm can be embedded into your infrastructure. And that is the nice thing, right? So much so that when you now go to a shop, you're standing in those circles, without having to explicitly say anything to anybody, now you're occupying the right space. So it's nudged you into an appropriate social distance. Right? And if somebody were to violate that norm, it becomes immediately visible, and the cost of monitoring comes down, and you just have to look up or maybe signal your disapproval, and that can potentially rectify the situation. So it's a beautiful example, right? Another example, this is a thing that we are working at CSBC is perhaps we can take red tape and put it on doorknobs to indicate, to signal in bright red that this is a surface that is often touched by people, so beware. Right? The reason why a lot of people do not comply with norms is not because they intentionally want to be non-compliers, but because they forget. So can you hear me, Nikita?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me give you an example of I have 2 kids at home, and I don't want them to enter the kitchen. And we told them a million times not to enter the kitchen. But we discovered that their non-compliance was on account of forgetfulness. So we just put a little red tape across the kitchen door, and that increased their compliance with the norm that I created at home by 95%. So that's a nudge. So you've got to think very creatively. And we are at CSBC, I have a fantastic team. They're coming up with tremendous ideas as we speak, and we are going to be advising the government.
Right. Another question, going back now to some of the concepts that you laid out for us earlier. One of the questions we have is about the problems of using incentivization or coercion. You use the alarm clock example as a bridge burning technique. So are there problems with using such techniques for behavior change?
Yeah. So the alarm clock example is one where you have exercised your own autonomy to abnegate your autonomy down the road. So in some sense, the coercion that you are imposing is the coercion that you are imposing on yourself. I have less of a problem with that than somebody else exercising coercion, right? So let's separate that. We got to be analytically very clear between these different varieties. The exercise of coercion by the state to get you to behave in a manner that does not cause harm to others is a fair type of coercion. Otherwise, we would not have laws, right? But the real ethical problem that one needs to talk about and think about is the ethics of nudges. When you use nudges, is there a likelihood of a certain element of deception where you're leading a person down a path of decision making, which the person might not have taken otherwise, right? That's the serious element. But there are two situations. When nudges are used by companies, at least the competition between companies ensures some measure of accountability. But when nudges are used by the government, who is there to evaluate whether the nudges are being used in a judicious manner or not? And that's why we need the courts to be far more mindful in evaluating the kinds of nudging that the government intends to use.
Right. Also, there, people, I think a lot of our audience, given that they are in the social sector and routinely trying to design effective interventions for their specific stakeholders, there are questions around how do you design an effective nudge? So once you've analyzed, the context, the biases, the behaviors, what does that process look like of determining, trying out a few options maybe and determining which one is the correct one? Somebody else has also asked the same thing in the context of the Chicago Road example that you shared. How does one discover that something like reducing the spacing in the lines going forward may be a good nudge for people?
So this is a very tough question, Nikita. So you can try and formalize and systematize the process of discovery, but the moment of revelation is always difficult to conceptualize. The moment of inventiveness, right? I'm often reminded of this brilliant scientist. His name was Kekule. He was trying to understand the structure of the benzene molecule, right? And it was a big, he thought endlessly about it. And one night he went to sleep and dreamt of a snake biting its own tail, from which he made a speculative leap of the imagination and came up with the idea that the benzene molecule is actually shaped like a tail. So some of these processes tend to be inscrutable. It's very hard to map them. However, we can try and create processes which can lead to systematizing the search process. So one of the things that we do at CSBC, which is sort of hardwired into our DNA, is to engage in this pre-experimental qualitative work, the ethnographic work, where we send out our people to go and interview our subjects. You got to use your empathy, you got to spend time there, and then, almost become a part of the people for whom you're trying to devise the nudge. And from that ferment of experience, you can come up with ideas. The human mind will come up with ideas. So we come back after a qualitative process, we come back into a room, and we have these really smart people. My team members are really smart. They come together, and then they, and the way the ideas start flowing is amazing, right? I can never conceptually, predict the process by which great ideas come with. I think that's foolish. I think it's a foolish endeavor. But you can minimize the risk of not coming up with ideas by getting people into a room, giving them freedom, and so on.
Right. So just expanding this question of designing nudges to, again, the current context. We all know that certain things like hand washing or, wearing masks especially has been so critical in many of the Asian countries in containing the spread of the virus. And yet we see, at least in our context, that a lot of people have not yet, adopted it as a sacrosanct practice. So any thoughts on how do we encourage all of these behaviors in India using nudges?
So I'm not sure if nudges are going to be sufficiently effective in getting people to use masks. I think you need social norms. And I draw a distinction between leveraging social norms and using nudges. Social norms, the use of social norms is a mechanism whereby we as a society become arbiters of what is compliant behavior or not, and we become the imposers of that expected cost. So getting people to speak up against non-compliers is, I think, a good thing. I think we need to send out a message into society to say, hey, listen, it's not just merely about your behavior, it's about somebody else's behavior that you need to monitor. Now we have outsourced the monitoring to people, and that can potentially lower the cost of the state monitoring people's behavior, and that can increase compliance. But I say this with a very strong caveat, and that is, when you try and place the power of adjudication in the hands of people, that can be seriously misused. It can be misused in the form of discrimination against certain communities. It can be misused in discrimination against marginalized communities. So we need to be very, very careful. There has to be a balancing act when we use social norms, when we legislate these social norms.
Great. Another thing, again, in the COVID context is, the language that we're using in discussing the virus and our fight against it is a lot of the war terminology, right? We have frontline workers, heroes, and the PM talked about dealing with the virus on war footing, quite literally.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting question on whether you think the use of this language itself maybe, somewhere, subliminally, subconsciously, shifting the importance in our own minds from, looking at it as an issue of public health to, priming us to maybe increase budgetary allocations towards war and defense. Like, what are the shifts that happen when we use language like this?
I'm delighted that you asked this question, because we recently ran an experiment. We are also doing experiments, online experiments, empirics at a distance platform, where we are trying to see if this language actually works or not. And our initial empirical evidence suggests that this language doesn't work. Right? So we used a particular message where we tried to frame the solution, the message as coming from an army officer, this Yodha, whatever, and see if that worked. We found that it did not work. What actually worked was a message that involved a health worker who has a more proximate relationship with providing a solution, rather than an army man, or the narrative of an army man going to war with the virus. So there is evidence. We already have some preliminary evidence to indicate that this language doesn't work.
That's fascinating. Also, another interesting question about death penalty. So, in the context of law, does deterrence through really harsh law, legal measures, does that change public behavior? And this has been discussed so much, especially in the context of sexual violence.
Oh my God, this is an emotionally charged question. I'm fundamentally against death penalty. Yeah, I believe in a jurisprudence of maybe life imprisonment. But death penalty, I think, is a sort of a knee-jerk. I do understand that the crimes that you're talking about are heinous, right? They're inhuman. But do we as a society also become heinous and inhuman? I think there is some merit in thinking that we should preserve our humanity at the end of it. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to say any more of that. Yeah, sure. I'm against death penalty. Although I admit that the most stringent forms of punishments need to be imposed against rapists, people who violate the rights of women or transgenders, or for that matter, the marginalized members of society.
Okay, so we'll leave this at that. The next thing I see here is, there's some curiosity around, given that nudges work because they speak to the, automatic side of our brains, the quick processing side of it. Do you think that there can be the possibility of nudges being used to trick people?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is the big worry about nudges, right? Because nudges can potentially disable your conscious decision making, right? So if they can disable your conscious decision making, your autonomy is in question. And if your autonomy is in question and you end up making decisions which are antithetical to what you would have otherwise done, then there's a problem. So you need a mechanism by which you can evaluate nudges. In the private sector, actually, paradoxically, there's less of a problem because Coke can nudge you into drinking bad stuff, but there would be another company that can nudge you in the other direction. So there can be a cancelling out effect due to competition in the private sector. But nudging by the government needs to be closely monitored by judicial scrutiny. And the interesting thing is, most nudge units around the world have not invited the attention of the judiciary yet. So as we go forward in creating our own behavioral insights unit for our country, which CSBC is undertaking right now, we need to think very seriously about the legal ramifications of using nudges and whether these nudges actually have an ameliorative and a beneficial effect on society or not. And what are the implications in terms of the compromise of autonomy that is required in changing human behavior.
Right. Interestingly, just related to what you said right now, there's a question about, given that there's this surge in nationalism, patriotism, people feel a connect to the nation right now. How do you use these positive feelings, this uptick, for national welfare? For instance, nudging people to pay full taxes, nudging people in the current situation to make sure that they pay full wages to their domestic staff and so on. So all the pro-social behaviors that are for larger social good and national good, how do you use the understanding of behavioral sciences towards that?
I'm a bit of an old school Trotskyite. And so leveraging nationalism can be useful, can be instrumentally useful in the short run, but it can also be dangerous in the long run. Let me switch to a slightly different example which might better illustrate the kind of a response that I can find to this question. Consider for a moment how you might change the behavior of men towards women. One way of doing this is by reframing a good man as a man who's protective of women, right? But this is and that might actually produce an effect that reduces domestic violence. The means that you have chosen has the likely effect of increasing masculinity, toxic masculinity, right? So there is a sort of a bit of a trade-off that you're making in choosing a means which accomplishes the short-run goal, but which might actually not do any good service to the end of gender equality in the long run. So it's not just the immediate ends that we need to be worried about, but it's also sort of the means that we use, and we need to systematically examine those means as we move forward. So nationalism is great. I'm also a massive fan of my cricket team and the Indian cricket team and so on and so forth. But at the same time, one should also be big-hearted enough to recognize the human tragedy across borders. Right? It's not just me, it's not my own country, but wherever there are suffering people, why can't we identify with them? And if nationalism is likely to interfere in my being a humanist, I would much rather give a preference to being a humanist.
Sure.
That's mine.
Great. So on that note, Pavan, I think we'll pause with the questions because we're at 12:30 now. But as a concluding note, any recommendations you want to give to our audience about resources that they should look up, especially for the young students and social entrepreneurs here who work with communities?
So I think there's a bunch of really exciting reading available out there. I think people need to read more about this stuff. That's one thing that they can do. And this is a message that I would give out to the younger members of the audience. particularly the cosmopolitan urban youngsters from the posh colleges of South Delhi. I think they need to go out into society a bit more. They need to interact with people less like themselves, develop the sensitivity that is required in empathy. And that gives you a tremendous purchase of an understanding of human behavior that can then be useful in thinking about policy, thinking about the grander things in society. That would be my suggestion. Go out and meet people. You can't be a behavioral social scientist without meeting people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pavan. This was really, really intriguing, all the examples that you shared. And also, it was wonderful to think through with you how we use all of this understanding in the current context. So thanks a lot for your time. Thanks to all of you for joining us today.